Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rao's IAS Study Circle.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 28th December 2021, and the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. This article on page number 1 is regarding the NGO Missionaries of Charity, which was set up by Mother Teresa, and it has been denied foreign contribution under the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act. In this regard, the Ministry of Home Affairs has said that they had some adverse inputs and they were noticed, and that is why they are denying the right of the missionaries of charity to achieve or receive foreign funding under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. In this regard, if you look at the General Studies paper 2, we have a topic by the name Governance in the GS paper 2. And in this particular part of governance in the General Studies paper 2, we have various subtopics like the NGOs, civil society, pressure groups, political parties, civil services, etc. And that is why, because this is related to foreign contribution to the NGOs and the FCRA, this topic becomes important for us from the mains examination perspective. Now, the government has denied the missionary of charity the access to foreign funding under the new amendments that were brought to this FCRA Act in 2020. And that is why any amendment to important acts in India are important for us from the mains examination perspective, especially if they have any impact on governance or Indian polity. Now, if you look at the question that was asked in mains 2020, it was regarding the amendments that were brought to the Right to Information Act. And we all are aware that the Right to Information Act was a benchmark act to provide accountability to the citizens regarding the functioning of the government. And that is why any amendment in the Right to Information Act will obviously have impact on the governance in the country. Either it will reduce or strengthen the accountability on the part of the government. That is why the question was, recent amendments to the RTI Act will have profound impact on the autonomy and the independence of the Information Commissioner. Discuss. So we were required to analyze what would be the likely impact of the amendments that have been brought to the Right to Information Act. Similarly, the amendments were brought out to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act in 2020. And in this regard, various NGOs and the voluntary sector organizations have raised concerns that the amendments to the FCRA will stifle the sector and make it harder for them to operate. And that is why you can practice this particular question regarding the amendments that have been brought to the FCRA Act in 2020. And in this regard, we'll look at what are the new amendments to the FCRA Act 2020, what were the arguments in favor of bringing about these amendments, and finally we'll look at what is the criticism of these amendments that have been brought to the FCRA Act of 2020. So that is how we will structure this discussion, which will be helpful for you to answer such question which can be asked in the mains examination. Let us look at all these aspects one by one now. So first, let us look at what are the salient features of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act Amendments Act 2020. So first provision under this is that it forbids a recipient of foreign contribution from transferring the foreign contribution to any other entity. That is, whatever money is being transferred to such NGO or voluntary sector organization will have to be used by that organization only, and they cannot transfer this amount to any other entity. This is particularly because sometimes it has been seen that these non-state actors or the NGOs divert these funds to various anti-national activities like terrorist funding or any other kind of threats to internal security. And that is why if these NGOs are receiving any amount of foreign contribution, that should be only used by them. So simply you need to understand that there are various countries which want to create internal disturbances in India. And that is why they will provide funding to various NGOs which are legitimate in India. And these NGOs will then divert the funds to the terrorist organizations, which will lead to internal security situations and problems in India. And that is why this particular feature was introduced under the FCRA Amendment Act 2020. Second important feature of these amendments was that it reduces the limit of usage of such foreign contribution for administrative expenses from presently 50% to only 20%. Further, the center can direct an organization to not utilize the foreign contributions pending an inquiry on the suspected violation. So if the government finds that there are suspected violations by an NGO of the provisions of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, even then whatever amount that NGO has received in terms of foreign contribution cannot be used by that particular NGO or voluntary sector organization. Further, the government has mandated that the foreign contributions must be deposited in FCRA account created in specified branch of scheduled banks, which was later notified as New Delhi branch of SBI. That is only with the New Delhi branch of SBI that these NGOs can receive the foreign contribution. That is what will make it easy for the government of India to monitor the foreign contributions that are being provided to various NGOs as well as the voluntary sector organizations. Further, the center will obtain Aadhaar numbers of the key functionaries of the organizations for the approval. This is also one requirement. And then it has provided provisions for suspension of the NGO in case of non-compliance and surrender of the FCRA registrations. So these are the penalties that have been imposed, and these are some of the checks that the government has now imposed so that the funds that are received by the NGOs are not misutilized. In this regard, first let us look at what are the arguments that were there in favor of bringing about these amendments to the FCRA Act of 2020. So first argument, as we have already understood, is that various foreign countries as well as non-state actors will try to stifle the internal security situation in India, and that is why they will try to divert the funds to the various terrorist organizations or other organizations that are likely to create internal security situations. And that is why the foreign powers and non-state actors continue to take up the activities that amount to interference in the internal polity of the country with ulterior designs. Sometimes these funds are also used by the various state actors as well as non-state actors to create disruption in India by the way of funding various protests, etc. Second argument in favor of bringing about these amendments was that it will ensure effective monitoring and it will also ensure accountability of the recipient association. Further, it is argued that the NGOs are expected to grow on the strengths of their own genuine work undertaken for fulfilling societal needs. And NGOs presently lack inner democracy and they siphon off to pay the owners of the NGO very high salaries. And thus reducing limit on the administrative expenses is necessary. So as we have seen, the government has brought about limits or reduced the amount that can be used in the administrative setups because sometimes the funds that these NGOs receive are diverted to the owners of the NGOs. Further, it was seen that some NGOs are routing these foreign contributions to other entities, and that is why it was creating a threat that such funds can be used for creating problems in the Indian polity, as well as such funds can be diverted to various terrorist organizations, etc. And that is why the government has provided for approval to receive the foreign contribution for a specified purpose. And if such diversion of the funds was allowed, it will be difficult to monitor the ultimate purpose for which these funds were being utilized. And that is why the government has set this limit of the end use of the money by these NGOs who are receiving the foreign contributions only. Further, it is being argued that the FCRA is a sovereignty and integrity legislation, and it has the overriding purpose to ensure that the foreign money does not dominate public life as well as political and social discourse in India. That is, the political and social discourse or any kind of protest or movement that takes place in India should be funded by the Indian public only if it takes place in the first place. And such protests should not be funded by the foreign countries to create instability in India. Further, it is being argued that it is difficult to monitor foreign contributions when branches are receiving the foreign contributions are spread across the country, and that is why this limit has been set up that the foreign contribution can only be received in the New Delhi branch of the SBI or the State Bank of India. Now, primarily the government of India brought about these amendments in order to reduce the misuse of the funds by the NGOs for creating disturbances in the Indian polity as well as diverting these funds for anti-national activities. However, these amendments have been sometimes misused by the governments themselves to stifle the voices of the NGOs, which are seen as a key part for creating an accountable governance in the India and their social intervention, which is seen as very important. So in this regard, some of the criticisms are that the provisions that have been introduced by the FCRA Act are blanket in nature and they paint all the NGOs under the same brush. And that is why there are chances of it being misused at times. Further, it is wrong to color all the foreign contributions as terror financing or for illegal activities such as money laundering. And that has been the primary purpose that has been stated by the government of India for bringing about these amendments. Further, it is seen that a large number of Indian citizens who are staying abroad want to contribute for the development of their countries. And that will be hampered because of such strict regulations that have been brought out by these amendments. Further, it is seen that such kind of amendments are against equality because policy keeps making access to FDI easier. At the same time, foreign contribution regulations are being made harsher. Also, the provision of choosing only one bank and one branch in one city for the foreign contribution does not seem logical to various NGOs as well as voluntary sector organizations. Also, it is said that the center cannot have a free pass in the name of national security, and center needs to show and establish how the national security is affected and how it is subversing terrorism, etc. Further, it is being argued that many NGOs are doing exceptional work across the country and they are harmless as they have never been found to be violating any kind of legislation. And that is why such blanket provisions of FCRA Amendment Act on the NGOs and the voluntary sector organizations can be detrimental to the overall developmental works that these NGOs are carrying out in our country. So, what we have seen in this discussion till now is that the government has brought out certain amendments to the FCRA Act in 2020. And these amendments were primarily brought out to stop the misuse or diversion of the funds by the NGOs for creating disturbances in the Indian polity as well as funding of terrorism. However, there have been various criticisms that have been forwarded against these amendments. And these are some of the arguments that you can use to write answers related to this practice question that has been created regarding the amendments that have been brought to the FCRA Act 2020. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, this article on page number 7 provides an analysis of the recently published draft regulations on the extended producer responsibility related to plastic waste in India. In this regard, in October this month, the Environment Ministry published In this regard, in the October of this year, the Environment Ministry had published the draft regulations on extended producer responsibility for plastic waste. And the draft extended producer responsibility rules related to plastic waste can be important for us from General Studies paper 3 point of view in the topic environment. And some of the points that we discuss here can also be important for us from the preliminary examination perspective. So in this article, we'll try to understand what exactly is meant by the extended producer's responsibility, what are the benefits of such EPRs, what are the likely achievements of this draft EPR policy, and finally, what are the likely issues that could have been covered under the new rules that have been provided by the Environment Ministry. Now, as far as the prelims examination is concerned, if you look at the prelims examination paper of 2021, a question was asked related to R2 Code of Practices. And this was regarding environmentally responsible practices in the electronics recycling industry. So similarly, any kind of rules or policies or practices that are introduced by the Government of India, Ministry of Environment or Central Pollution Control Board regarding recycling of the waste, be it plastic waste or electronic waste, they are important for us from the preliminary examination perspective. And as such, the EPR related to plastic waste are important for us from the prelims examination perspective as well. Now, if you look at the extended producer's responsibility in terms of the plastic waste, it is basically a policy approach where the producer of such plastic waste or any kind of plastic products are given significant responsibility of recycling that waste. And in this, they are provided with some responsibility related to financial as well as physical responsibility for the treatment and disposal of these post-consumer products. Now, for example, if there's a company which produces a packet of chips, and it bears the cost of making, packaging and distributing such packets of the chips, it will also have to bear the responsibility of collection, recycling and reuse of the plastic wrappers that it had produced in the first place for the packaging of the chips. That is, on the one hand, it will have to take care of the production and the cost of production of such packets, and at the same time, it will also have to handle or bear the responsibility of collecting and recycling and reusing such plastic products, which are finally converted into plastic waste after the usage by the consumers. And assigning of such responsibility in principle provides incentives to prevent waste at the source, promote product designs for environment, and support the achievement of public recycling and materials management goals. So if the responsibility is provided to the producers themselves, they will themselves create designs which are environmentally sustainable and will also focus on recycling of such products. Further, the EPR requires the manufacturers of a product or the party that introduces the product into the community to take the responsibility of its life cycle. That is, from the stage from which it is produced to its use and to its disposal. So from the stage of production of that plastic to use and to the disposable level, the life cycle of such plastic products will have to be taken care of and this responsibility of whole life cycle of this plastic product will lie with the producer himself or herself, or a company that produces these plastic products. And that is why this aims at covering the entirety of the process through which any plastic product goes on. So that is basically what is meant by the extended producer's responsibility. So the producer's responsibility is not just of producing any kind of plastic product, but it will also have to take part in the disposal and the reuse and recycling of that product. That is the basic meaning of extended producer's responsibility. So some of the benefits of the extended producer responsibility are that it will lead to integration of the environmental costs by the producers themselves. Secondly, it will lead to improved waste management. It will lead to reduction of the disposal because the material that the companies will design will themselves be environmentally sustainable and environment friendly. That is what is meant by environment friendly designing that will be undertaken by these producers of plastic products. Further, it will reduce the burden on municipalities and will promote design of environmentally sound products because this will mandate the producers to spend in research and development of such environmentally sustainable products. Now, what are the achievements of this draft extended producer's responsibility for plastic waste policy? In this regard, the brand owners and e-commerce players have been brought under the ambit of extended producer's responsibility, which are known to be major producers of such plastic products which lead to the generation of plastic waste. Further, the EPI are now applicable to both pre-consumer as well as post-consumer plastic packaging waste. So EPR is also applicable for pre-consumer plastic packaging, that is packaging that is done at an wholesale level, and also post-consumer plastic packaging, that is the plastic packaging that is used for providing the products to the consumers or the end consumers. So that is why both these stages have been taken care of in the draft EPR rules. Then the producers and the brand owners or the PIBO have been assigned the targets for the collection of plastic waste that they put out in the market. So basically targets have also been set, and that is what will make them more accountable. And as such, provisions and the targets for collection, reuse and recycling and use of recycled plastics have been laid out clearly. So these can be seen as some of the achievements of the draft EPR policy that has been introduced in case of plastic waste. However, there are certain issues that still need the attention of the government. Let us look at these issues that have been highlighted in this article. Now, although the extended producer responsibility puts the responsibility on the producer for the end use, recycling and reuse of the plastic product, but it does not talk about plastic waste reduction or minimization of the production of the plastic waste, which should be basically the first principle of waste management, and it has not been included in the draft EPR policy by the Environment Ministry. So this is one of the concern, that the policy does not talk about plastic waste reduction or plastic waste minimization, but it only talks about clearly mandating or marking the responsibility of the producers on the overall life cycle of the plastic products. Secondly, the compostable and the biodegradable plastics have not been included under the EPR mandate of collection and processing. And that is why the compostable as well as biodegradable plastics should have an EPR mandate of collection and processing, as it is important to channelize them to relevant facilities for proper treatment and processing. So as such, the compostable as well as the biodegradable plastics have not been included in the mandate of EPR. They should also be included because they also form a considerable part of the plastic waste that is generated. Then there is ambiguity around the action plan to be submitted by the producers and brand owners, that is PBIOs. Now this ambiguity is because it is mandatory for the producers and the brand owners to submit an action plan according to these draft rules. However, the template for such action plan has not been discussed or provided anywhere by the Ministry of Environment. And as such, there is a need for clearly laying out a clear template in which such action plan should be created by these producers as well as brand owners. Further, it has been highlighted that there is lack of transparency, as the centralized portal that has been developed by the Central Pollution Control Board is a closed door portal, which means that it is not out there in the public sphere. And this portal can only be accessed by the producers and the brand owners, plastic waste processors, recyclers, State Pollution Control Board as well as the Central Pollution Control Board. However, they should have been in public so that the environmental activists as well as public at large could also have made the stakeholders more accountable. Another concern that has been raised is that although brand owners and the e-commerce companies have been included, the informal sector has not been included in the draft EPR. And as such, there has been non-inclusion of the informal sector in the draft EPR. However, the informal sector also plays a key role for turning waste into usable and tradable goods. And that is why the authors have analyzed that there is a need for the informal sector to be included in the draft EPR policy, as most of the plastics in India are channelized by the informal sectors. So some of the issues related to the EPR guidelines include that the EPR guidelines do not focus on reduction or minimization of the plastic waste. Rather, they just focus on clearly marking the responsibility of the plastic waste recycling or plastic waste management on the producers. Secondly, biodegradable products have not been clearly mandated under the EPR rules. Further, there is ambiguity regarding the action plan that needs to be submitted by the producers as well as brand owners. Further, the portal that has been created by the Central Pollution Control Board is a closed door portal and it is not open in public so that the activists or the public can hold these bodies accountable. And lastly, there has not been inclusion of the informal sector, which is known to be playing a key role in the processing of the plastic waste. So all these are the issues. If they are included in the EPR rules when they are finally published, will make it more effective in nature. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 8 has been written in the context of the recently released State Health Index report by the Niti Aayog. In this, Kerala has been ranked as the top performing state in the Niti Aayog's Health Index report. So all the points that we will discuss in this article can be important for us from General Studies paper 2 point of view in the topic social justice, where health and education are two important aspects for us from the mains examination perspective. And some of the points that we discuss here can be used as data in answering the questions related to health performance of various states across India. In this regard, we will first look at the indicators that have been used by the Niti Aayog to produce this health index. And after that, we'll look at what are the key performances of the states in this regard. In this regard, if you look at the parameters that are used by the Niti Aayog in preparing the state health index are first the health outcomes, second is the governance and the information related aspects, and third are key inputs and the processes. In the health outcomes, it uses some of the parameters like neonatal mortality, under 5 mortality rate, sex ratio at birth, and maternal mortality ratio. As far as governance information is concerned, it takes care of the average occupancy of the key posts of the state government for last 3 years with regards to health governance. This includes the mission director, director health services at the state level, chief medical officer at the district level, etc. And have they been occupying their position for an average 3 years or not. Further, regarding key inputs or the processes, the Niti Aayog takes into account the proportion of the state government health expenditure to the total state expenditure and the proportion of the healthcare providers against required number of healthcare providers in public health facilities. So these were the 3 parameters and the sub-parameters that were used by the Niti Aayog in producing this state health index. So in this regard, let us look at the key findings of the report based on the state health index of the Niti Aayog and the performance of the various states. Now the states in this regard have been categorized into larger states, smaller states and union territories. In the larger states category, Kerala and Tamil Nadu are the top performers. In the smaller states category, Mizoram and Tripura are the top performers, while in the union territory categories, Delhi and Chandigarh are among the top performers. In the larger states category, Uttar Pradesh is the lowest performing state. However, it ranked at top in terms of the incremental performance by registering the highest incremental change from the base year 2018-19 to 2019 and 20. That is, as far as the overall increment is concerned, the increment is high in case of Uttar Pradesh as compared to any other state in India. Now this is primarily because Uttar Pradesh is the lowest performing state, and because of such low base of performance, the improvement has been recorded highest in case of Uttar Pradesh. Further, with regards to the individual parameters that have been used by the Niti Aayog in preparing this index, if you look at the health outcomes, in majority of the states, progress was observed in neonatal mortality rate, under 5 mortality rate as well as maternal mortality rate. And all the larger states recorded a reduction in the under 5 mortality rate between 2014 and 2018. And this is a critical indicator for survival of newborn children. Further, some states like Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, Maharashtra, Punjab and Tamil Nadu have achieved the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal target for the under 5 mortality rate. That is 25 child deaths under 5 years per 1000 live births. So you can use this data that we are discussing here in writing the answers related to health performance of these states. Further, as far as the sex ratio at birth is concerned, it varied widely with 840 girls per 1000 boys in Uttarakhand to about 974 girls per 1000 boys in Kerala, which is considered to be one of the highest. Further, if you look at the time period between 2014 to 18, the sex ratio at birth improved only in 5 larger states, including Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Jharkhand, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh, while in the remaining 14 states, it registered a decline, which is the cause of concern as far as the sex ratio at birth is concerned. Now, this is a cause of concern because it is primarily related to the preference for the male child in the Indian societal structure, and that has led to an adverse sex ratio in India. Then, if you look at the other parameters like governance and information as well as key inputs, the average occupancy of the key administrative positions at the state level and the district level was about 14 to 15 months over the 36-month period, which was mandated or considered as ideal by the Niti Aayog. Further, in half of the larger states, the average occupancy of the state level 3 key positions was only 12 months or less. Now, the occupancy of the key administrative positions for a period of 3 years is considered to be a stable tenure of these positions. And these are essential for good governance because of the kind of stability that is there in terms of decision making related to health related issues. And according to this report, there is clearly room for several states to decrease the frequency of transfers of administrators at the state as well as district level to ensure continuity, improved accountability, and effectiveness. In terms of key inputs and processes, all the larger states had shortage of required specialists, especially at the district hospital level. Majority of the states have either not yet started or have only a small proportion of public health facilities with quality accreditation. Finally, half the states registered a decline in the state government health expenditure to the total state expenditure from 2015 to 2016 and 17. So these are the key takeaways from the report of the Niti Aayog related to the 3 parameters and the overall performance in these 3 parameters. And that is why the report has suggested that to improve the performance of the states on various parameters, these are 2 important government policies that needs to be implemented in letter and spirit. First is the Prime Minister Atmanirbhar Swasth Bharat Yojana. And in the Union Budget of 2021 and 22, the government has launched this centrally sponsored scheme. The objective of this scheme is to develop capacities of primary, secondary, and tertiary care health systems, strengthening the existing national institutions, and create new institutions to cater to the detection and cure of new and emerging diseases. That is why this is seen as a very important government scheme. Further, regarding the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi, it is a single non-lapsable reserve fund for share of health from the proceeds of health and education cess that is levied by the government of India. The proceeds of the share of the cess that is levied related to health is credited into the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Nidhi. And these funds will be utilized for flagship schemes of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare like the Ayushman Bharat, Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, Health and Wellness Centers, National Health Mission, Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana, Emergency and Disaster Preparedness and Responses during Health Emergencies. That is why implementation of these policies is key for achieving improvement in all the parameters that are used by the Niti Aayog for analyzing the performance of the health related issues by various states. So these are key observations of the report of the Niti Aayog, and some of the observations that we have seen here can be used in writing the answers in the social justice section in the health sector. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 10 is related to an instrument that is used in the Carnatic music that is known as Nagaswaram. So it is important for us from the art and culture point of view, and let us look at some points related to this Nagaswaram. Nagaswaram is also spelled as Nagaswaram, Nadaswaram, etc. and it is basically a conical double reed aerophone from southern India. Now it can be as long as 95 centimeter, that is 35 inches, and it is primarily used in Carnatic music and is used in various ceremonies. Now a parallel of this in the northern India that is used is the Shehnai. That is, the Nagaswaram is similar to the Shehnai that is used in northern India, Pakistan as well as Bangladesh. So these are some points related to Nagaswaram which are important for us from the prelims examination perspective. This article has been written in the text and the context section of today's newspaper, and it is basically related to freedom of speech and expression. Now, it has particularly been written in the context of the hate speech event that was held in Haridwar in the Uttarakhand, and that is why this has again started the issue of hate speech. Now, various reasonable restrictions have been provided on the freedom of speech and expression in the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution in the Section 19(2). Now, although various restrictions have been provided in the context of the freedom of speech and expression, the Indian Constitution fails to identify which all speech can be considered as hate speech or which all speech can be considered as seditious. And that is why there is a debate regarding what would amount to be a seditious speech or what would amount to be a hate speech. And that is why this issue was covered previously in the month of September in the DNS. So let us revise from that video various aspects of the definitional challenges that are there in the defining of hate speech and what are the various issues and the provisions and the suggestions of the Law Commission in this regard. In this regard, we need to analyze the different aspects of hate speech in India, how it is being punished, what are the provisions in the Indian laws, and has it been defined or not. In this regard, the Law Commission of India has provided various recommendations. So we'll look at these different aspects from the General Studies Paper 2 point of view in the topic Governance, Constitution and Polity. And that is why this becomes a very important topic for us from the mains examination perspective, because hate speech has continuously been in news and it is seen as the misuse of the fundamental right that has been provided in the Article 19(2) related to freedom of speech and expression. So in this regard, let us first try and understand what has been the conception of the right of freedom of speech and expression. Then we will look at what are the various legal provisions that tackle hate speech in India. In this regard, what can be the impact of hate speech on the freedom of expression? Also, what have been the various recommendations of the international bodies regarding the hate speech? And after that, we'll look at some of the parameters can be used to define the hate speech, the manner in which the regulation of such hate speech should take place, and also the recommendations, both legal as well as non-legal measures provided by the Law Commission of India. Let us look at all these aspects one by one. Now, in a polity, it has been said that rights are the cornerstone of individual autonomy. They are guarantees as limits on the power of the state. We all know that the state is all powerful. However, these rights act as limits on the power of the state. In democratic societies, they have been granted to protect individual from undue state interference. Freedom of speech and expression has been enshrined in the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It is considered to be one of the most significant rights as it allows a person to attain self-fulfillment and strengthen the capacity to fully enjoy freedom. And that is the whole conception of the rights. That is, it is the cornerstone of individual autonomy. They are guarantees as limits on the power of the state. In democratic societies, they protect individual from undue state interference. They have been recognized internationally under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And also, they are considered most important because these rights allow a person to attain self-fulfillment and it strengthens their capacity to fully enjoy freedom. In this regard, in the Indian Constitution, we have two important articles related to freedom of speech and expression, and some restrictions have also been placed on such articles. So in this regard, in the Article 19(2), it places reasonable restrictions on the exercise of right of freedom of speech and expression in the interest of four factors. First, security of the state, sovereignty and integrity of India. Second, friendly relations with foreign states. Third, public order, and also decency or morality, or in relation to the contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offense. In this regard, the Article 21, which relates to the life and liberty, highlights that liberty is not to be exercised to the detriment of any individual or to the disadvantaged sections of the society, which clearly highlights that liberty is not unlimited freedom and it has certain amount of restraints. So clearly, as we see the conception of rights, the freedom of speech and expression, and what are the reasonable restrictions provided in the Indian Constitution, let us next look at what are the legal provisions related to hate speech in India. So when it comes to hate speech, the term hate speech has not been clearly defined in any law in India, and that is the biggest issue that we face in tackling the menace of hate speech. However, there are various legal provisions which provide for or prohibit selected forms of speech as an exception to the freedom of speech. And such exceptions that have been provided to the freedom of speech are sometimes considered as being hate speech. However, it has been found difficult to clearly identify what all amounts to such exceptions to the freedom of speech. So in this background, let us look at how Indian Penal Code considers what is an exception to the freedom of speech. Firstly, the section 124A of the Indian Penal Code penalizes sedition. Secondly, the section 153A penalizes promotion of enmity between different groups on the ground of religion, race, place of birth, residence, language, etc. Thirdly, the 153B penalizes imputations, assertions prejudicial to the national integration. Article 295A penalizes deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings of any class by insulting its religion or religious beliefs. The section 298A of the IPC penalizes uttering words with deliberate intent to wound the religious feelings of any person. And the section 501 and 2 of the IPC penalize publications or circulation of any statement, rumor, or report causing public mischief, enmity, hatred, or ill will between classes. But in reality or on ground, it becomes difficult to clearly identify what kind of speech will promote enmity between different groups or what kind of speech has been given deliberately with malicious intention. It is because the intention behind such speech cannot be clearly identified based on the laws that are existing in India to tackle the hate speech. Now, besides the IPC, there are other acts that deal with the issue of hate speech. In this regard, one of the platforms where the hate speech is being used continuously in India are the elections in India. And accordingly, the Representation of People Act 1951 in its section 8 disqualifies a person from contesting election if he is convicted for indulging in acts amounting to illegitimate use of freedom of speech and expression. The section 123 and the section 125 of the Representation of the People Act prohibits promotion of enmity on grounds of religion, race, caste, community or language in connection with the election as a corrupt electoral practice and prohibits it. Now, besides IPC and the Representation of the People Act, the Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955 tries to counter any hate speech which tries to promote untouchability, which has been a very menacing exercise or a practice that has existed in the Indian caste system. Then the Religious Institutions Act 1988 also provides for such provisions. In this regard, the district magistrates have also been provided with certain powers to tackle the issue of hate speech. The section 107 and the section 144 provides that the executive magistrate can prevent a person from committing a breach of peace or disturb the public tranquility or do any wrongful act that may probably cause breach of peace and disturb the public tranquility. It also empowers the district magistrate, the SDM, or any other executive magistrate specially empowered by the state government in this behalf to issue order in urgent cases of nuisance or apprehended danger. So certain amount of discretion has also been provided to the district magistrates, and that at times is misused and at times is used to curb the freedom of speech and expression or the rights that has been provided in the Indian Constitution. Then the question arises as to what is the impact of hate speech on freedom of speech and expression. Now, in this regard, it has been outlined that the hate speech is an expression which is likely to cause distress or offend other individuals on the basis of their association with a particular group or incite hostility towards them. For example, if any speech amounts to causing distress or it aims at offending a particular caste or particular religion, then such kind of an expression or speech can be considered as hate speech. Further, hate speech undermines the implicit assurance that has been provided to the citizens of a democracy. In this regard, this assurance has particularly been provided to minorities and the vulnerable sections of our society. And at times, the hate speech is used against minorities, the vulnerable groups, including the caste groups, or also the gender. Further, the technological revolution, and especially the internet and the accessibility of internet, allows offensive speech to affect a larger audience in a short span of time. And accordingly, tackling hate speech becomes exclusively important for the state in this regard. In this regard, the Human Rights Council's report has outlined that freedom of speech can be restricted on following grounds. First includes the child pornography to protect the right of the children. It can be restricted on the ground of hate speech to protect the rights of the affected communities. Defamation to protect the rights and reputation of others against unwarranted attacks. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide to protect the rights of the others. Advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And this has been provided in order to protect the rights of the others, such as the right to life, etc. Thus, even the Human Rights Councils recognize that there is need for restricting the freedom of expression in certain cases, and these are the cases that have been identified by the Human Rights Council. In this regard, what are the parameters that can be used to define hate speech have been outlined by the Law Commission in its report. First is, it should include the extremity of the hate speech, that is, the speech must be offensive and should project the extreme form of emotion. Second, if such hate speech is leading to incitement, it can be defined as hate speech. Thirdly, it also should take into account the status of the author of the speech, because people who hold power to influence society on a large scale can have damaging impact on the harmony in this society. In this regard, one of the example of the status of the author of the speech can be the hate speech given by the political authorities, and these politicians have high amount of power to influence society on a large scale. So in case any political speech is leading to or promoting enmity between two caste groups or between two religions, can be considered as or can be used in defining the hate speech. Fourth important aspect of defining the hate speech is the status of the victims of the speech. If any particular speech by a politician targets a particular community or the religion, then that particular community or religion, if that is vulnerable, that will also define or be a part of the hate speech. So a politician, for example, knowingly lays himself open to close scrutiny of his every word and deed by both journalists and the public at large. And accordingly, he must consequently display a greater degree of tolerance, because politicians are always in the public scrutiny, and that is why any speech against politician might not be considered as hate speech. On the other hand, if a speech by the politicians and if it targets any particular person or any particular caste or religion, then that kind of speech should be considered based on the status of the victims of the speech. And also, in what context was the speech given should also form a part of the definition of hate speech. So every seemingly hate speech may not be termed as hate speech, because the context in which the speech was made is essential in determining its permissibility. So these are some of the parameters or factors that can be taken into account for defining the hate speech. However, even after providing these parameters, the Law Commission has restrained itself from defining the hate speech clearly. Then the Law Commission talks about the manner of regulation of the hate speech. In this regard, the Law Commission has recommended that any attempt to regulate hate speech need not shrink the space for criticism and dissent, because the Constitution itself provides for freedom of speech and expression, and if we are here to regulate the hate speech, it should not curb the right that has been provided constitutionally to the citizens of India. And as a consequence, not all hate speech can legitimately be made the subject of legal prohibition. Secondly, the right is curtailed by the means of law passed through appropriate procedures and through provisions worded in explicit and unambiguous language. So for the laws that are regulating the hate speech, they should be passed through appropriate procedures, through provisions that are worded in explicit and unambiguous language. Also, such laws which regulate the hate speech must measure or must directly satisfy a legitimate aim. And last but not the least, such laws must be necessary to achieve its stated aim and must be proportionate to the harm that it attempts to prevent or redress. In this regard, some of the recommendations provided by the Law Commission include: incitement to violence cannot be the sole test for determining whether a speech amounts to hate speech or not. Even speech that does not incite violence has the potential of marginalizing a certain section of the society or individual. That is why the hate speech should not be limited to incitement to violence. Secondly, the term hate speech has been used invariably to mean expression which is abusive, insulting, intimidating, harassing, or which incites violence, hatred, or discrimination against groups which are identified by characteristics such as one's race, religion, place of birth, residence, region, language, caste or community, sexual orientation, or personal convictions. Then political speeches should take place in an environment that does not foster abusive or hateful sentiments. In this regard, it recommends that the Model Code of Conduct should be amended to expressly provide a provision that prohibits any kind of speech that promotes or attempts to promote feelings of enmity, hatred between different classes of citizens of India on the grounds of religion, race, caste, community, or language. And care must also be taken to differentiate hate speech from sedition. This is because sedition directly targets the state and also the integrity of the state. However, hate speech can be different from this particular aspect. Accordingly, care must be taken or special care must be taken to differentiate between what would amount to hate speech from that of sedition. Further, the Law Commission also provides for certain non-legal measures that can be adopted for tackling the hate speech in India. In this regard, it recommends popular television dramas which subtly and effectively promote harmony between warring communities. Secondly, the involvement of religious heads should be taken to build empathy across religion lines to decrease or reduce communal tension. Also, strategic intervention should also take place, especially in the context of social media, to monitor the dissemination of hate speech and mob mobilization. Also, persuading people should be done who are the weakest links to stop spreading or harmful rumor. And lastly, the Law Commission has recommended certain amendments to the Indian Penal Code and certain sections of the IPC. So the Law Commission has recommended that whoever on the ground of religion, race, caste, community, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, place of birth, residence, language, disability or tribe uses gravely threatening words, either spoken, written, signs, visible representations, within the hearing or sight of the person with the intention to cause fear or alarm, or advocates hatred by the words, either spoken or written, that causes incitements to violence, shall be punishable with imprisonment for either description for a term which may extend to 2 years and fine up to 5,000 or with both. Also, whoever publicly or intentionally on the grounds of religion, race, caste, etc. displays any writing, signs or other visible representations which is gravely threatening or derogatory within the hearing or sight of a person causing fear of alarm or with the intent to provoke use of unlawful violence against that person or another shall be punished with imprisonment for a term which may extend up to 1 year or fine up to rupees 5,000 or both. So these are the various aspects of hate speech that have been outlined in the Law Commission of India's report. What are the parameters that can be used to define hate speech, and also what exactly is the impact of hate speech. And finally, it has recommended certain legal measures as well as non-legal measures to tackle the menace of hate speech. With this, let's take up the next news article now. With this, we conclude today's discussion, and this is the question for the day.